a black doctor, exhausted after saving lives on the front lines of a global crisis, finally boards his flight home. He's ready to exhale, to rest, to be just another passenger in the sky. But within minutes of takeoff, everything changes. A flight attendant questions his presence in first class. Then, a second one joins in. "Are you sure you belong here?" they ask. Their voices just loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. The murmurs start, the eyes follow, and before he can even process the absurdity of the moment, security is called. What happened next stunned everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to share. It's time the world listens. It all started with an ordinary flight that turned into something far bigger. The morning light in Harlem had a peculiar way of breaking through the blinds. Soft but insistent, like a whisper that refused to be ignored. David Whittaker sat at his kitchen table, the scent of black coffee curling in the air, mingling with the distant sounds of the city waking up. The radiator clanked in the corner, a relic of a time when men like his father built things with their hands, only to be told their labor belonged to someone else. David took a slow sip, his fingers tracing the rim of the cup. 42 years old, and every morning felt heavier than the last. He had lived long enough to understand that the weight of a man's life was not always measured in years but in the number of times he had to swallow indignation and keep moving. His son, Malcolm, shuffled into the kitchen, still in the process of shaking off sleep. 15 years old and already taller than David, with a mind that was sharper than he let on. "Morning, Pop." "Morning, son." David watched as Malcolm poured himself a glass of orange juice and leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. "They did it again," Malcolm said. Finally, David set down his cup, his stomach tightening. "Who?" Malcolm hesitated, as if debating whether to say it at all. Then, he let out a breath. "Mr. Simmons told me to take off my hoodie before class started. Only me. Everybody else still had theirs on." David exhaled through his nose. He had seen this before. He had lived this before. The thing about men like Simmons was that they never raised their voices. They never had to. A quiet look, a carefully worded instruction, just enough to remind you that you were different, that the rules bent around certain bodies and tightened around others. "What did you do?" David asked. "I took it off," Malcolm said, his jaw tightening. "Didn't say nothin'." David nodded slowly. Good. He wanted to say, but also, not good. He had spent his whole life teaching Malcolm how to navigate this world. Be smart. Be careful. Don't give them a reason. But how do you tell a 15-year-old boy that there will always be a reason? "You did the right thing," David said finally. Malcolm nodded, but he wasn't convinced. Neither was David. Outside, a car horn blared, and the city pressed in again. David looked at his son. The same boy who still left his sneakers in the hallway, who used to fall asleep with comic books on his chest. The same boy who, one day soon, would have to understand the full weight of what it meant to be seen before he even opened his mouth. David took another sip of coffee, the bitterness settling on his tongue. "Go get ready for school," he said. Malcolm nodded and left the room. But the air between them was still heavy. David sat back, listening to the sounds of his boy moving through the house. The weight of the morning had only just begun. The city had a way of making you feel invisible and seen at the same time. David knew this better than most. By the time he stepped onto the subway platform, the morning rush had thickened into an uneasy rhythm. The tired faces, the impatient shuffling of bodies, white collars and blue collars, polished shoes and scuffed sneakers, all moving towards something or away from something. David found a spot by the edge of the platform, hands tucked into the pockets of his overcoat. He was dressed like any other working man. A pressed shirt, a tie, shoes that had seen better days. Yet, experience had taught him that no matter how he presented himself, there were those who would still only see the color of his skin. The train pulled in, doors yawned open, and David stepped inside. The seats were full, so he grabbed a pole, settling into the small space between a woman with a designer handbag and an older man in a suit who clutched his newspaper like a shield. Across from him, a young white woman was scrolling through her phone, earbuds tucked into her ears. She was lost in her own world, oblivious to the fact that the man beside her, a broad-shouldered, middle-aged white man in a navy blazer, was staring at David with quiet calculation. David recognized the look immediately. Not the open hostility of the past. No, it was something subtler now. Something more refined. The man leaned slightly toward the young woman, tilting his head in David's direction. He spoke just low enough to make sure only she could hear. David saw it in her face. The flicker of unease, the slight tightening of her grip on her phone, the way she shifted in her seat just so. She didn't look at him. But she didn't have to. He had seen it before. The man in the navy blazer sat back, satisfied. David swallowed the familiar burn in his throat. He could feel it rising in his chest. That old rage, the one that threatened to unravel the years of careful restraint. He could say something, could lean in, let his voice cut through the hum of the train, force the man to confront his own cowardice. But David knew how these moments played out. A raised voice from him would turn him into a problem. The white man would become the concerned citizen. The young woman the innocent bystander. And David, the aggressor. So, he did what he had always been told to do. He let it pass. The train lurched forward, pushing them all toward their separate destinations. David exhaled through his nose and reminded himself, stay small. Stay quiet. Do not give them a reason. And yet, he wondered how much longer he could keep swallowing moments like these before they swallowed him whole. David had spent his life learning the art of silence. It was a skill passed down through generations, stitched into the fabric of his being by fathers and uncles and men who had lived long enough to know the cost of being too loud, too visible. But silence did not mean peace. It only meant survival. The morning had started as any other. Coffee lukewarm in his travel mug. The steady rhythm of his shoes against the pavement. The mechanical greetings exchanged with coworkers as he stepped into the law firm's marble lobby. David had worked here for 6 years. 6 years of careful navigation. Of smiling just enough. Of keeping his voice measured in meetings. Of watching younger white associates rise faster. Their mistakes overlooked. Their confidence unearned. He had long accepted that some battles were not meant to be fought head-on. But today was different. Today, the partners were gathering to discuss promotions. David had been preparing for this moment. His numbers were strong. His cases are airtight. He had earned this. And yet, as he sat at the long conference table, he could feel it, the quiet resistance, the careful avoidance of his name. They spoke of leadership, of client relationships, of cultural fit. The words were polished, diplomatic, but David understood what they meant. When they spoke of Jason, young, white, affable, they called him a natural leader. When they mentioned David, their tones softened into something patronizing. Steady worker, reliable, a valuable team player. Not once did they say his name in the same breath as partner. David felt his pulse in his ears. He thought of his father. The way he used to come home exhausted, shaking his head at the invisible lines he could never cross. He thought of the stories his grandfather told, of men who worked twice as hard for half the reward, who swallowed indignities so their children might have a better chance. And now here he was, sitting at the table, still being denied the seat that should have been his. The weight of silence pressed against his chest. He could speak now, demand what he had earned, name the thing they were so carefully avoiding. Or he could do what he had always done. Swallow it, let it pass. Walk out of this room the way his father had walked out of so many. His dignity intact but his rightful place denied. David clenched his jaw. For the first time, he did not know which choice would cost him more. The world had a way of making a man prove himself twice. Once for his own belief, and again for theirs. David had learned this lesson before. But some truths had to be relearned. Beaten into the body over time. Each encounter a reminder that the architecture of injustice was built to look like reason. A week had passed since the partners' meeting. A week of waiting. Of pretending he hadn't already seen the decision written in their eyes. The email came late on a Friday. A carefully worded rejection wrapped in compliments. We appreciate your dedication and professionalism. While your contributions to the firm have been significant, we've decided to move in a different direction at this time. We encourage you to continue demonstrating leadership as we reassess opportunities next year." David read it twice, then a third time, just to be sure he wasn't imagining the familiar sting. The truth was clear: they would take his work, but not his name. They would use his labor, his mind, his skill, but they would not let him rise. He closed his laptop and sat back in his chair, staring out at the city beyond his window. The skyline gleamed, tall buildings filled with men who had never been asked to wait. Never been asked to prove their worth beyond the simple fact of their existence. David exhaled slowly. This wasn't a disappointment. Disappointment required surprise. This was exhaustion. And yet, exhaustion was not an excuse. He thought of his younger brother, fresh out of law school, still believing that merit alone could carry a man forward. He thought of the interns, young, black, ambitious, watching him, studying his steps, hoping they led somewhere. David picked up his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen. The easiest thing would be silence. To nod, accept, remain, to let the system have its way, to wait another year, to keep hoping they would see him differently if he just kept his head down long enough. But he knew better. The world did not change by waiting. His father had waited. His grandfather had waited. David would not. He tapped out a message to the senior partner. "Thank you for your consideration. I'd like to set up a meeting to discuss the firm's decision and my future here." Send. The architecture of injustice had stood for centuries. But even the strongest buildings cracked under enough pressure. The meeting was set for Tuesday morning. David arrived early, as was his habit. There was something about being the first in a room, settling in before anyone else arrived, that made it easier to hold his ground. Not that it would make much difference today. The senior partners, Caldwell, Strauss, and Martinez, walked in together, as they always did. Three men who had mastered the art of looking like they carried no bias at all. Their smiles were tight, their nods polite. David recognized the choreography. This was not a conversation. It was a performance. They sat across from him, leather chairs creaking under the weight of their authority. "David," Caldwell began, folding his hands on the table, "we appreciate you requesting this meeting." A practiced pause. "It shows initiative." David smiled, though there was nothing funny about being praised for daring to ask why a firm he had given 10 years of his life to had no room for him at the top. "Let me be direct," he said. "I'd like to understand why I was passed over." Strauss shifted in his chair, cleared his throat. "It's not about performance," he said. "Your work is excellent. Your leadership is strong," Martinez added, nodding. Caldwell sighed, as if the weight of the decision had pained him personally. "David, we had to consider a variety of factors. We're looking for a cultural fit at the partner level. Someone who aligns with the firm's long-term vision." David had heard those words before, just in different forms. A good fit, the right image, a natural leader. Each phrase is a quiet way of saying, "Not you." "I see," David said, voice measured. "And in what ways do I not fit?" A flicker of discomfort passed across Caldwell's face, but it was gone in an instant. "I wouldn't put it like that," he said. "It's about continuity. Our clients trust our leadership to maintain a certain level of familiarity." Familiarity. David sat back, nodding slowly, as if considering their words. As if he didn't already know. "I understand," he said finally. Relief flashed in Caldwell's eyes. That was the moment they thought he would thank them for their time, shake their hands, and walk away with the same quiet dignity they expected from a man in his position. But David was done being quiet. "You know what's funny?" he said, keeping his voice calm, almost conversational. "This firm has promoted 5 new partners in the last 3 years." He turned to Martinez. "You were one of them. And when you were promoted, there were whispers, people questioning if it was too soon, if you were really ready." Martinez stiffened, but David wasn't looking for a reaction. He turned to Caldwell. 2 years ago, when you brought in Logan, fresh from his father's private practice, with a resume half as strong as mine, we were told it was because he had exceptional leadership qualities." Caldwell's jaw tightened. And then, finally, David looked at Strauss. And last year, when Jason was made partner. Despite losing 2 major cases, the reason given was that he had relationships with key clients. A silence settled over the room. A thick, heavy thing. Because the truth had weight. And David had just laid it at their feet. Martinez exhaled slowly. Caldwell looked down at his hands. Strauss, ever the diplomat, was the first to speak. David, if you feel that we've overlooked something, we're happy to revisit. Quote. No, David said. You won't. A pause. I don't need you to revisit anything. I need you to acknowledge what's happening. None of them spoke. Because they couldn't. Because to say it aloud would mean admitting what had been designed to remain unspoken. That he had never been meant to succeed here. That no matter how hard he worked, how many hours he billed, how many cases he won, the weight of his skin was heavier than all of it. David stood. He buttoned his suit jacket. The room shrinking around him as the moment stretched. I'll be submitting my resignation by the end of the week, he said, and I won't be leaving quietly. The words landed like a gavel striking wood. Final. Unshakable. He walked to the door, feeling their eyes on his back, the weight of their silence pressing down. But this time, it did not touch him. This time, he was already free. David had not slept. The truth had a way of sitting heavy on a man's chest, pressing down in the stillness of the night. His resignation letter sat on his desk, unsigned, not because he doubted his decision, but because he knew what it meant. Once he sent it, there was no going back. No quiet endurance. No pretending that the weight he had carried was anything other than what it was. A burden he had been asked to bear with grace. A burden he was now refusing. He dressed slowly, deliberately. A navy suit, white shirt, tie knotted just so. Every inch of him is sharp, polished. He looked the part. But that had never been enough. The office was silent when he arrived. Not in the way offices were in the early morning, filled with the hum of machines and the low murmur of voices. No, this was the silence of a space that knew something had shifted. He walked to his office, past desks where his colleagues suddenly found emails urgent, papers fascinating. The weight of his name had changed overnight. David had become a man to be watched. Not because of what he had done, but because of what he might do. He had disrupted the order of things. And that made him dangerous. At noon, his phone rang. Private number. He knew who it would be. David. Caldwell's voice was steady, measured. I was hoping we could talk before you make any final decisions. Final. A word that tasted different in Caldwell's mouth than in his own. David let the silence stretch before answering. I'm listening. They met in a private conference room. A room designed for control. For quiet conversations that could shift a man's future without leaving a mark. Caldwell sat across from him. Hands folded. The picture of reasonable authority. We respect you, he began. David almost laughed. But we're concerned about the way things ended yesterday. Tensions were high. Maybe we all spoke too soon. David tilted his head. Did we? A pause. You're a valuable asset to this firm. David. Caldwell's voice was smooth, practiced. Losing you would be a loss for everyone. David understood what was being offered. A chance to stay. To take what had happened and let it fade. Like all the other slights before it. But he also understood what it would cost. To stay meant to swallow the truth. To let it settle in his bones. To carry it forward in silence. Again. Tell me something, Caldwell, David said finally. If I stay, will I ever be made partner? A flicker of hesitation. Caldwell leaned back, exhaling through his nose. David, these things take time. It's about relationships. About trust. You have to understand. Quote. I do understand. David's voice was calm, but firm. He did understand. More than Caldwell would ever admit. More than Caldwell could ever afford to admit. Because the moment a man like Caldwell admitted the truth, even to himself, the whole structure of his world would shake. I've given this firm 10 years. David said, his voice measured. How much longer should I wait? Caldwell had no answer for that. Because the answer was never. David stood. He buttoned his jacket, slid the resignation letter across the table. Caldwell took it, eyes scanning the page, lips pressing together. Is this really what you want? David smiled. For the first time in a long time. He wasn't being asked to shrink himself. And that, more than anything, felt like freedom. I think the question, David said, is whether this is what you deserve. He turned and walked out, leaving silence in his wake. David walked, not because he didn't have anywhere to be, but because for the first time in a long time, the weight was his own to carry. And his alone. No firm, no title, no pretense. Just a man, in a city that had always known his name but never truly seen him. The streets were alive with their usual rhythm. The hurried footsteps of men with places to be. The distant wail of sirens. The low murmur of a city that never stopped moving. But David felt the shift. A slow unraveling of something inside him. He had stepped out of the game. But the game was not done with him. The coffee shop on 47th was exactly as he remembered it. The smell of burnt espresso. The scrape of chairs against tile. The quiet refuge of people who needed a moment to catch their breath. He ordered black coffee and sat by the window, watching the world move past him. No briefcase. No laptop. No disguise. A woman sat a few tables away, stirring sugar into her cup. Her eyes flickering toward him with something like recognition. David knew that look. She was trying to place him. And when she finally did, her expression shifted. Not anger. Not disgust. But something colder. A quiet judgment. A knowing. The way white folks looked at you when they thought you had stepped out of line. As if they owned the path you walked on. As if they had built it for you. And you had the audacity to refuse it. She left before he finished his coffee. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. Because the message had already been sent. David let the warmth of the cup seep into his hands. He had spent years proving himself in rooms that had been built to keep him out. Had sharpened himself into something palatable. Something acceptable. But none of it had changed the truth. And the truth was this. He was only ever as valuable as his usefulness to them. And now that he was no longer willing to play the game, he was something else entirely. A problem. A threat. A lesson. The cautionary tale they would whisper about behind closed doors. His phone buzzer. Unknown number. He knew who it would be. And he was right. David. Caldwell's voice was smooth, even. We need to talk. David smiled. Of course they did. The only thing worse than a black man with ambition was a black man with nothing to lose. And David had never felt freer. He let the silence stretch before answering. I'm listening. David had learned, long ago, that the world did not move by accident. Everything had a design. And every design had an architect. Even when the walls looked like they were crumbling. Even when the floorboards seemed to give way beneath his feet. Somewhere, someone was standing steady, holding the blueprint, watching, waiting. Caldwell sat in the high-rise office, bathed in the cold glow of the city below. The kind of man who could command a room without raising his voice. The kind of man David had spent his life trying not to become. We gave you everything, Caldwell said, leaning back in his chair. And now you want to throw it away? David laughed, soft, almost to himself. Everything. What a strange word for them to use. Like his time had belonged to them. Like his ambition had been on loan. Like they had been doing him a favor by letting him walk among them. I was never yours to keep, David said, folding his hands together, his voice even. Caldwell's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. A calculation. A weighing. David knew what he was thinking. How to make this right. How to make him pliable again. How to remind him of what he stood to lose. Do you really think you can walk away from this and be okay? Caldwell asked, his voice calm, measured. The world doesn't work like that. David, you know it. And David did know it. He had seen the long shadows that followed men like him. The quiet erasures. The sudden disappearances. Not into the ground, no, but into something just as empty. A name removed from a guest list. A seat quietly given to another man. The kind of silence that was louder than violence. David stood. He had spent his entire life believing that if he worked hard enough, if he was smart enough, careful enough, he could outrun the thing that had always been chasing him. But the truth had been waiting for him at every turn. You cannot outthink a system designed to crush you. You cannot negotiate with men who do not see you as human. You cannot win a game that was never meant for you to play. You need me, David said, his voice steady. More than I need you. Caldwell exhaled. Slow. David could see the tension in his jaw. The tight coil of power and restraint. He wasn't used to this. A black man who knew his worth. A black man who did not ask permission. The city stretched out behind them, gleaming and infinite. But David was no longer looking at the city. He was looking at the man in front of him. A man who had built an empire on the backs of men like him. A man who had never imagined, not once, that one of those men might turn to him and say, "No." Caldwell blinked. David turned. And as he walked out of that office, into the night, into the unknown, he felt something shift. Not just in him, but in the world. A fracture in the foundation. A break in the design. A reckoning.